recording now.
Oh, no, I don't mean that.
Oh, I did turn it on.
Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. Today we are still on location in Glastonbury, where we are now sitting with Mr. Geoffrey Ashe, who is a prolific author on subjects having to do with King Arthur, Glastonbury. This is one of many of his books on British mythology. Has been involved in writing travel books as well, always including much about the history of Britain and the British Isles. And they go on and on. I'm sure you've seen some of his work in bookstores across the United States and elsewhere. They've been published and translated into many languages. And on it goes. So we're very pleased and fortunate to be able to sit down and speak with Geoffrey in his home here in Glastonbury, where he's lived for many years. He's also been a visiting professor at various universities across the United States, and is now here working on yet another book on prophecy, which he'll be giving us some bird's eye view into during our conversation. So Geoffrey, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. Absolutely. So, of all things to study, what is it that initially inspired you to take up a study of King Arthur? Many have done it, of course, over the years, but why you and why Arthur?
Well, actually Arthur was not the first interest. The first interest is Glastonbury, which is where we are now.
Yes.
It's a place with many facets, many mysteries, many legends, myths, and extraordinary history, of which Arthur is only part, actually. A long time ago, I discovered that there was a prophecy that Glastonbury would be reborn. It was in ruins for many years, and somehow or other this appealed to me. I took an interest, I wrote a book about it. I've tried to further the rebirth of Glastonbury in various ways. But in the course of writing the book, of course, I had to consider Arthur, because he is part of the Glastonbury legends, and it sort of went on from there. But I always like to say to any interviewer, anybody, I'm not an Arthur monomaniac. These books are well known, they've sold, but I've written on many other things and taken many other interests.
Including on Gandhi.
Gandhi, yes indeed.
Biography.
That's quite true. He was, I think, the first public figure that I ever became aware of as a child, because he came to England for a conference about the future of India, and of course he got all the limelight because all the rest of the delegation dressed in European style, and he went around in a loincloth. And so
that made an impression of London.
Course, yes. And I saw pictures of him in the papers and asked who he was. I don't think I could have told you who the Prime Minister was then, but I did know who Mr. Gandhi was.
Oh, that's funny. That's right. And so you took enough of an interest in him to
much later,
compose a book.
Much later,
yes.
Because after his death, things began to come out that had not been mentioned in his lifetime, which I thought made him more human, more interesting, in some ways less admirable, in other ways more admirable, certainly more interesting.
Interesting.
So I wrote this book, yes.
Now your own background, just to go into your own academic history a bit, is you went to school both in England and in British Columbia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
University of British Columbia and Cambridge?
I was born in England, and this country is really my home.
Yes.
But my parents emigrated. I was at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and then after returning to England, I was at Cambridge, so in fact I have been to both those universities.
Yes, and you were focusing on English literature.
My official subject was English literature.
And your unofficial?
Well, my unofficial was history. I have what is perhaps a rather rare distinction of having really and truly read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire all the way through.
My word.
And I was absolutely enthralled. And I suppose it was natural to get into this region which is history and literature and sort of in between.
Right, the world of myth,
yes.
of legend.
Yes.
Sure. In fact, maybe you could even speak to that, Geoffrey, because one of the assists you've given to the academic world is to separate out fact from fiction and make distinctions between history and romance while valuing both. Could you speak to us a little bit about how these have gotten a little enwrapped in some of the legends of Glastonbury in particular?
I think it's very important to hold these things together and not get them too separated. The academic scholar, of course, does separate them and discusses documents and doesn't discuss legends.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember years ago I was involved in the excavation at Cadbury, the possible site of Camelot. And of course the archaeologists, the archaeological establishment, were furious. They said it was absolutely wrong to talk about legends, and they blamed the director of excavations. They said he was just talking all this nonsense about Arthur to raise money for his dig, because Arthur was popular with the public. Well, that wasn't fair, but I think it very important indeed to keep these things together, to let them converge. And if I've contributed anything to Arthurian studies, I think perhaps the convergence is an important contribution. I have held things together and to some extent got people to talk to each other.
Yes, interesting. In a sense, you've non-academized this world.
To some extent, I think so, yes.
Now, what is it about Glastonbury that you found so fascinating and that's held your interest for so many years?
It's very difficult to define, actually. It is a magical place.
It's probably the only place in Somerset County that is world known.
Well, I'm not sure. Taunton might object. But no, Glastonbury is known as others are not, certainly.
Yeah.
And it has a multiple history. As probably a pagan sacred site, certainly as one of the most important Christian ones, possibly the first in this country, and in modern times as a revived cultural centre, and of course as a sort of alternative spiritual capital, where the people who used to be called the hippies gathered, and now the people who are called the New Age gather.
Yes.
But it has its own magic, and I have felt that it's very much alive, but it has its own personality. Many people have come here, you know, with the idea that they were going to do some particular thing here. They were going to exploit the magic to preach their own doctrines or whatever. Now that's a mistake. Glastonbury tends to rather reject people who come with a preconceived idea. It's a very powerful place. And even with the famous legends, you know, one of the wisest things I ever remember hearing said about Glastonbury was by Aelred Watkin, a Benedictine monk at Downside Abbey, a great medieval historian, who said to me, "You have only to tell some crazy story in Glastonbury, and in 10 years' time it's an ancient Somerset legend." He wasn't ridiculing Glastonbury. He meant its power, you know, its myth-making capacity.
Oh, yes.
And I've seen this happen. I've seen a thing become an ancient Somerset legend in 4 years flat.
It does say that there's something about the power of Glastonbury that confers a special sense to language, to the power of the word.
Yes.
That's for sure. But let's hope that whatever myths are created here are for the general good.
I hope so. Some of them, I would say, are not, but we won't go into that.
That's right. Now we have the Tor in Glastonbury, which is what people see when they first arrive because it towers above everything. Then there's Chalice Well, there's the Abbey. Could you just walk us through a little bit of these fine places, each of which are independently powerful and unique, and at the same time there is an interesting interconnectedness, it seems, as well, between representing perhaps different kinds of vortex energies or what have you?
Well, now, if you visit Glastonbury, you know, the visitors to Glastonbury normally start at the Abbey, which I think is quite right. There's a great complex of ruins at the centre, which marks this early Christian site, and a great religious house in the Middle Ages. That has to be the starting point, I think. And it's associated with Arthur because he was said to be buried there. It's associated with the Holy Grail. Now, let's imagine your tour a little further. If you have the energy, go over to the south side of the town, and there is the Tor, a hill. It rises 500 feet above sea level, more than that. It seems to be some kind of a pagan sanctuary. It has what appears to be a sort of maze or labyrinth round the side. At the foot of the Tor you can visit Chalice Well, which is probably a pagan sacred spring and said to be a healing spring. Now those are three great places, and if you have any energy left, go on to Weariall Hill, which is said to be where Joseph of Arimathea, who came from the Holy Land, some say with the Holy Grail, and landed here in Glastonbury, which was then a seaport. But certainly, touring, begin with the Abbey, and then the Tor next, and then see how you feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, they do say, and I was at the Abbey just the other day, that Arthur is buried there. Mm. It is a burial site.
Yes.
What is the truth of this?
The question of Arthur's burial is rather a puzzling one. There are several different accounts of what happened to him, and of course there is the legend that he never died at all. He's asleep in an enchanted island, or he's asleep in a cave, and one day he will wake up and his knights are there. And
well, maybe he's treasures. Immortal.
Well, immortal. When I compiled the guidebook that you mentioned, I found that Arthur is asleep in 15 caves, but never mind that.
Okay.
I think he's quite equal to that. But the question of the Abbey is curious. The Welsh always kept it a secret where his burial was. He was their particular hero. But in the 1180s or thereabouts, a Welsh bard told the English king Henry II that Arthur was buried in the graveyard of Glastonbury Abbey. A few years later, the abbot carried out an excavation. They found a large, rather crude sort of coffin and a stone slab with a cross under it with Arthur's name on it, various other things. And in this coffin were the bones of a tall man who appeared to have been killed by a blow on the head. And they enshrined these, and the cross certainly did have Arthur's name on it. Now, if you look at most writers on this subject, they say that this was a kind of publicity stunt, that there was no real basis for saying it was Arthur, that the monks with their abbey had been burnt down, they needed money for rebuilding, stories of Arthur were popular, so it would enhance the prestige of the abbey if he'd been buried there. Actually, it's not a complete...
So even then, there were advertising campaigns?
Well, I rather think myself that this is a modern notion read back into the past.
Okay.
Because we don't find that the monks did try to raise money by exploiting this grave. I think it's just a conjecture, really.
Based on our own more modern
Based on our own approach, yes, exactly. But anyway, some years ago, Dr. Raleigh Radford, a very distinguished archaeologist, discovered this grave. It had all been filled in, of course, but he dug down and he certainly found where this coffin was. There's no doubt at all that they found a very early burial. Now, was it Arthur? Well, that depends on the cross with his name on it. And like many tantalising things about Glastonbury, it disappeared. So we don't know.
God.
I'd say we can just sit on the fence about this one.
Yes.
Most historians would say it was definitely a fake. Some historians think it wasn't. I mentioned Aelred Watkin a little while ago, at Downside Abbey, who probably knows as much about Glastonbury as any man, and he said he thought Arthur's grave was genuine. I was rather surprised to find that such a distinguished scholar did think so. So I just sit on the fence about Arthur, about the grave.
Yes.
We can say, yes, there was an early grave there, and that's about all we can say with certainty.
Oh, thank you for that. As long as we're on such controversial subjects as Arthur, I would like to ask you, in the same kind of vein, about Joseph of Arimathea, and the legend of Jesus being here as well.
These stories are part of the Christian legend of Glastonbury, and one has to distinguish. Now, Glastonbury was a seaport at the turn of the Christian.
It was an isle, the Isle of
Very
Avalon.
nearly an island, and there are the remains of a Roman wharf here, actually. You could come up from the sea, from the Bristol Channel. Now, it is said that Joseph and his companions came here, perhaps from persecution in AD 63, and settled here. Now, what this story grew round, something that was quite real. This is a church, a very, very old church on the site, built of wattle work, which is twigs bound with clay, reinforcements of timber and lead, and the only thing we can say about this is that nobody really knew who had put it there. Every record of the abbey just calls it the old church, and it's already there.
The old wattle church.
The old wattle church. And in fact, wattle can be quite an efficient form of building. It was used by early settlers in what is now the state of Wisconsin. You can see an example still in New Harmony, Indiana, which it started out as a sort of utopian community founded by the Welsh philanthropist Robert Owen, and a lot of his buildings are still there, and one of them is partly wattle. So if you want to see what the old church was like, go to New Harmony, Indiana. But anyway,
it's not as much fun probably as Glastonbury.
Not as much fun, no. So stories grew around this old church.
Yeah.
That it was miraculously built, planted there by God himself, that it was planted by disciples of Christ, various stories. And one that goes back quite a long way is that it was Joseph of Arimathea, but it doesn't go anywhere near to the beginning of the Christian era. We don't really know where this story came from. The one about Jesus, supposedly coming here as a boy because Joseph was his uncle, I think that's not a very old story, actually. I mean, in the Middle Ages, supposing it was believed he had come here in person, what a thing the monks would have made of that. And they never mention that story at all. They talk about Joseph, they don't talk about Jesus. I believe this is one of these cases of telling a crazy story in Glastonbury. I've been told that that story began because a school teacher quite near here, about 100 years ago, wrote a play for the children to act where she imagined Jesus visiting the place. Lo and behold, 10 years from then, it was this ancient Somerset legend. I've been told that this is the case. I don't know.
Yeah, so one took 4 years, that one took 10 years.
Mine took 4 years, yes.
I see, right. Isn't that? So, in other words, there is nothing but legend to support
people in
imagination.
Persons. It's very old. I mean, there is serious archaeological evidence, carbon dating and so forth, that does take us back to somewhere about 500 AD, plus or minus 50 years or so. That doesn't prove there wasn't something earlier. There may have been. We can't prove it. And the particular persons, of course, like Joseph, no. But now here's something that is not often realized. We're often told Joseph brought the Holy Grail to Glastonbury, the vessel of the Last Supper. That's it. Well, of course, there are all these medieval legends and romances about the Grail and the quest for it and so forth. But I once asked people who first said that Joseph of Arimathea brought the Grail to Glastonbury. The answer, I believe, is Tennyson. Not much over 100 years ago. The stories of the Grail go back further. The stories of Joseph go back further.
And the 15 hides.
Well, the 12 hides is all right, yes. Yeah. That's the old monastic property. That goes back a long way. A lot of it does go back a long way. No, but Joseph bringing the Grail to Britain, I believe that's Tennyson. Extraordinary as it sounds.
Poetic license.
Oh, quite, yes, yes.
My word. About the 12 hides, though, that's the tears and sweat of Jesus, is that correct?
When you say the 12 hides, what it normally means is the territory around here that belonged to the abbey originally. A hide was a measure of land, It was supposed to be as much land as would support a family. It varies a lot from one part of the country to another, 50 acres, 70 acres, whatever. From a very early time, the abbey owned 12 hides. Now, in the Middle Ages, it acquired more and more property. Glastonbury 12 hides was the original. But eventually, in the Middle Ages, all the land for many, many miles around belonged to the abbey. And they reclaimed it from the sea, and they built sea walls and farmed it and so on. And it was said that if the abbot of Glastonbury could marry the abbess of Shaftesbury, they would have more land than the King of England.
Well, that obviously disturbed Henry VIII.
Henry VIII was rather easily disturbed.
Yes, right. Well, that was sort of the beginning of the end of the abbey, since in 1539 he hanged the abbot White at the time, correct?
Well, Henry had been dissolving abbeys all over the country and seizing their property. Glastonbury was almost the last, actually. It was very big and very rich, and there didn't seem to be much excuse. I mean, usually he sent commissioners down who said, the monks are living a scandalous life, it must be abolished. Actually here they were living quite properly, I gather. But I've read some of the reports by Henry's commissioners, and one of them said, the monks are so well disciplined that they don't offend, but they would if they could. And that was good enough. And in November 1539, the king's men seized the abbey and all its lands and hanged the abbot. By the way,
and quartered him at Tor.
Oh, definitely. And they sent bits of him all over the county just to show what happened. Incidentally, I think viewers might be interested here. It's the origin of a nursery rhyme. Little Jack Horner sat in the corner eating his Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, what a good boy am I. Jack Horner was a real person. He was a man who lived near here. He knew a great deal about the properties of the abbey. And when the king's men were breaking it up, John Horner gave them a lot of advice. And the story goes that they gave him all the documents relating to the properties. He put them in a hamper, he took them to the king, and on the way he took out the title deeds of one of these properties, the Manor of Mells, and kept it for himself, and it's been in the family ever since. That was little Jack Horner's plum, and that's the origin of the nursery rhyme.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's so interesting. How would we have known that other than you sharing that with us, Geoffrey? Thank you very much.
Mind you, one thing more, in honesty, the family are still there, but they say that he paid for the property. So who knows?
Yes, who knows? Of course they'll say that.
Yes.
I just want to get to a couple of points before, because I see the clock is ticking here. What I meant to say before was the sweat of Jesus that I think was said to have come in a thimble with Joseph of Arimathea.
That was the abbey's story. The abbey never recognized the Grail. There was something kind of suspect about it. The church never really took to the Grail story.
But they did say
some
acknowledgement.
They said that Joseph brought what they called two cruets, so small vessels with the drops of the blood and sweat of Jesus in them, which were buried with him. But they never recognized the Grail as such. There was a feeling, I think, that it was a rather mystical, symbolic kind of story that didn't fit very well with the normal position of the church.
But if there was an acknowledgement of the cruets, then it suggests greater efficacy to the story, you could say, of Joseph's being here.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I think there is...
apart from there not being any, say, archaeological evidence, it may be that the story gives this support to the truth of it.
Well, it could be. A lot of people here have always believed, literally, in the story of Joseph. There's one man I remember, he was an expert on the old Somerset dialect, and he said to me once, he said, around here, the sign of your being accepted is that you get a nickname. Now, he said, we don't say Joseph of Arimathea here, we say Joe Mathea. He's one of us.
Okay. These little linguistic points might serve us highly. In our last moments, I know it's not fair, but you are working on a book on prophecy. The subject of prophecy is very, very intriguing to many people right now. Are there a few words that you could share with our audience about what it is you've been uncovering or discovering in your research?
Well, prophecy has got to come very much to the fore because of the so-called millennium, which of course is completely phony. It's not the 2000th anniversary, and it would only be Christian anyway, not Jewish or anything else.
That's
but
for
still,
sure.
People think
that
there's
long
something
ago.
in it, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've always had an interest in prophecy. Indeed, before Glastonbury, before any of these things, I remember I got at it the hard way. When I was about 10 or 11, I took the Bible off the shelf and started reading the book of Revelation and trying to make sense of it. Now, the great John Calvin said anybody who studies that book is either mad when he starts or mad when he's finished. I think I managed to avoid that.
On both sides?
Yes, but I have always had this interest. And I think what's important at the moment is to sort things out. If you take Nostradamus, who has been so much in the last few years, the trouble there is that people try to prove too much. They try to make out that Nostradamus foretold Hitler, nuclear war, all sorts of things he didn't foretell. And that just
He did not?
No, most certainly not. That just makes him look ridiculous. It discredits him. Now, if you study Nostradamus carefully and discriminatingly, he did score. He did very well with some things. He did extraordinarily well with Napoleon, for instance. But I think trying to make out that he predicted all sorts of things in the 20th century is only muddying the waters. And I think it's important with this, and in many other cases which I'm working on, where people have taken a prophecy that is really interesting and then spoilt it by not criticizing it, not discriminating properly. And so I'm really trying to get at the facts behind these things. And asking, of course, when it happens, how does it happen? How does anybody see the future? Because they do sometimes. But the question is, how does it happen?
Sure, of course. That's a psychological, mystical, and neurophysiological question, which I think we all deserve to know the answer to.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Geoffrey. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to have you
Mitchell.
on.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I hope you continue to do your prolific writing for the sake of us all.
Oh, I will,
Good.
yes.
Good. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World in Glastonbury. Thanks so much for joining us. Please give me a call at 212-420-0800. Share your thoughts and feelings with me. Hope you enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Completely wrecked everything because the last minute was heard when he didn't think it was.
Oh, right. That happens to the best of us.
Yes, quite.
It's actually kind of funny. Is there anything in your current research on prophecy that is startling you or giving you some indication of what may be happening that we all may need or should know about?
Well, there is. I think it would take more than a minute to explain it.
Yeah, that's okay.
You want me to try to explain it?
Yes.
Well, you're not filming this now, are you?
We're getting it on because I might be able to splice it in.
I see. Well, a thing that strikes me very much is that it's easy to say, see the future, but just try to think this thing through. Suppose Nostradamus, for example, did see the future. Well, it's hundreds of years after his time. He wouldn't understand what he was seeing. So, and he's supposed to foresee, for instance, a certain conference between a French marshal and the Tsar of Russia, which was of great political importance. But suppose he did see them. Here's one gentleman talking to another gentleman. He wouldn't know anything about it.
Right.
So what I think one has to recognize is that you can say, see the future, but that doesn't really tell you what happens. You have to say, how do they understand the future? And I have an increasing impression which I support from different angles, that it's a two-way thing, that to a certain extent the future is flowing back to us, that there's somebody up there who is informing us. This brings questions of multidimensional time and goodness knows what.
Yes.
But I worked out a little analogy for this in terms of space. Imagine two people, Jim and Jane, that's what I've called them, in separate cars driving across the landscape.
Yes.
Jim has got a bit ahead because Jane is back here waiting for a passenger.
Just hand me that bag.
Jim passes a rockfall, let's say, and he phones back to Jane, look out for that rockfall 3 miles ahead. Well, presently, she gets her passenger and starts, and she says, now, 3 miles ahead there's a rockfall, and doesn't tell her to say how she knew. So they get to it, and the passenger thinks, gosh, she has paranormal powers. Now, I have the notion that in some sense, awareness of the future is a two-part thing. It involves communication between somebody here and somebody up there, and that explains how they know. But of course, this wasn't my idea, not originally. It was used by Stephen King in one of his stories, actually, and long before that, by a great science fiction writer, Olaf Stapledon, who wrote a book called Last and First Men, where he imagined millions of years in the future, and there he imagines scientists in a remote future who get back to the past. And he says a lot of your stories about ghosts and things are really due to our experiments getting back to the past.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in that. That we have to picture the future coming back to us, right, and not only us going into the future, but this takes quite a bit of thinking out.
Yeah, I would say
What
so.
I am clear on is that just seeing the future doesn't explain these things. You could see the future, but you wouldn't know what was happening.
Well, I thought that was one of the points about Nostradamus, that he was using language as best he could that would